picture this. You're standing, shoulder to shoulder with thousands of other people on a ferry in New York Harbor.
Yeah.
The wind is whipping off the water, camera phones are all held high, and everyone is just staring up at that iconic, oxidized copper green of the Statue of Liberty.
It's quite a sight.
Oh, absolutely. And millions of people make this exact pilgrimage every single year. But as you step off that boat onto the pavement, what you probably don't realize is that the very ground beneath your feet, the island that holds up this universal global symbol of American immigration, it actually owes its original name to a 17th century immigrant.
Yeah, from a tiny municipality in East Flanders.
Which is wild.
It really is. It's one of those hidden foundational layers of history that completely changes how you look at a famous landmark, where you can walk right over these incredible ghosts of the past every single day without a second thought.
And unearthing those ghosts is exactly what we are getting into today on this deep dive. For the next little while, we're going to follow the trail of a researcher who spent 22 years acting as a historical detective.
That's a massive amount of dedication.
Seriously. Just painstakingly tracing the Van Landsuut family and the broader emigration from the Meet-Jesland region of Belgium all the way to the United States. Our mission today is to completely reframe your understanding of early American immigration. We're going to trace the rise, the massive expansion, and the sudden total disappearance of one family's empire over 5 generations.
Sure.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Well, to really appreciate the sheer scale of this story, we have to completely reset our mental timeline.
Right. Because we all have a specific picture in our heads.
Exactly. When you think about immigration to America, especially in the context of New York, your mind almost automatically goes to Ellis Island, right?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Late 19th, early 20th century, sepia-toned photos of steamships, people crowded on decks.
Precisely. And the researcher who spent 2 decades on this, they actually note that in the Ellis Island records from 1892 to 1924, there were about 4,000 people from the Meet-Jesland region who made that journey.
Okay, so a decent number.
A very decent number. But for our story today, we have to rewind the clock
Hmm.
way back. We are going over 200 years before those mass waves of the 1840s and 1890s.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, we were talking about the mid-1600s.
Right. A time when crossing the Atlantic wasn't just, a matter of saving up for a steamship ticket. It was a brutal, terrifying voyage in a cramped wooden vessel.
Completely different experience.
It took anywhere from 4 to 7 weeks, entirely depending on whether the weather decided to let you live, basically.
It was a massive gamble.
But before we even meet our main character, who actually braved that terrifying crossing, we have to understand the precedent, because this wasn't an empty frontier. Which brings us back to that island in New York Harbor.
Exactly. Before you get massive waves of immigrants, you have to have a proof of concept. And the research highlights a man named Isaac Bedloe.
Bedloe. Okay.
Now, his family's original name was Bidelou, and they were from French Flanders. They eventually moved through Meldegem and into the Netherlands.
Yeah.
But the historical footprint shows that Isaac Bedloe was already living in New Netherland before 1638.
Wait, let me stop you there. 1638.
Yep.
The Mayflower was what, 1620? So we're talking practically day 1 of European settlement here. This is before New York was even called New York.
Precisely. It was still very much a Dutch colony. And Isaac wasn't just surviving on the edges. He was thriving. I mean, he was accumulating wealth.
Really?
So much so that he became the owner of a massive plot of land in the harbor, an island situated just south of where Ellis Island is today.
No way.
Yeah, it was nearly 60 hectares of prime strategic real estate.
And he named it Bedloe's Island, which is wild because it wasn't until 1956 that the name of that specific island was officially changed to Liberty Island.
Crazy to think about.
That's like casually finding out your great-great-grandfather owned the actual field where Woodstock happened, but nobody remembers his name. It's an astonishing piece of trivia.
It really is.
But I have to ask, if Bedloe is this early pioneer who is already buying up entire islands in the harbor, where does our main subject, Cornelius Langevelt, even fit into this? Like, is he just arriving late to a party where all the good land is already taken?
Not at all, but Bedloe's success is crucial because of how information traveled back then. Bedloe is the proof of concept that creates these whisper networks back in Europe.
Ah, okay. Word of mouth.
Exactly. You have to remember, 17th century Europe was plagued by wars, rigid class structures, and very limited economic mobility.
You were born into your class and you stayed there.
Right. So when word filters back across the Atlantic taking months to arrive, by the way, that a guy like Isaac Bedloe just bought a 60-hectare island, It creates a massive psychological shift.
People suddenly see a way out.
Yes. It lays the economic groundwork for ambitious, hungry young men like Cornelius II. They realize that the frontier isn't just a death trap, it's a place where the old rules of class and wealth don't apply.
So if you have the nerve to survive the ocean, there is unprecedented opportunity waiting on the other side.
Exactly.
And Cornelius II definitely had the nerve. Let's look at what it actually took to survive in that environment, because it was not easy.
Far from it.
The researcher found that Cornelius II was born in Saint-Laureins in July 1628. The timeline places his arrival in New Netherland around 1653 or 1654.
Making him about 25 years old.
Right. And he doesn't just quietly blend in when he gets off the boat. Just a year or two after he arrives, in 1655, he's already on the books paying 8 guilders in taxes as a tobacco merchant.
He hit the ground running.
He really did. Then, in 1657, he pays 25 guilders to become a small burgher of New Amsterdam.
And that small burgher status, that's a fascinating mechanism of early colonial life. It wasn't just a fancy title you put on your door, it was a highly specific economic moat.
Meaning what, exactly?
Well, to survive in New Amsterdam, you had to play by the rules of the Dutch West India Company. They wanted to build a permanent settlement, not just a temporary trading post where people come and go.
Right, so how did this small burger thing actually work? Was 25 guilders a massive fortune that required a loan, or was it just an annoying administrative fee? Like, how big of a barrier to entry are we talking about here?
Think of it somewhat like a modern-day taxi medallion in a major city, but for all retail and guild trades.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, it was a substantial sum for a young immigrant. It effectively acted as a barrier to keep transient, fly-by-night sailors from pulling into port, selling a bunch of cheap goods off their ship, and draining wealth out of the local economy.
So it protected the locals.
Exactly. Becoming a small burgher granted you the right to engage in free trade and gave you privileges within the local guilds, but you had to earn it.
You couldn't just buy it outright if you just arrived.
No. It required living in the city continuously for a year and 6 weeks, plus paying that 25 guilder fee. Though, that fee also applied if you married the daughter of an existing burgher or were a company employee.
Okay, so Cornelius was highly strategic. He was deliberately buying his way into the economic inner circle to protect his business.
Completely.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because his business wasn't just setting up a polite little tobacco shop on a cobblestone street.
No, not at all.
The reality of his hustle was incredibly gritty. Between 1662 and 1664, Cornelius co-owns a boat with a man named Albert Andries Bratt. And they aren't ferrying diplomats around.
Definitely not.
They are hauling cargo. Specifically, they're trading beavers and tobacco between New Amsterdam and Beverwyck, which is modern-day Albany, New York.
Which means they are navigating the Hudson River, which at the time was the absolute central artery of wealth for the entire colony.
It was the highway.
Yeah. The beaver trade is literally the reason New Netherland existed. European forests had been largely hunted out, and beaver pelts were essential for the felt hat industry back in Europe.
Oh, right.
So by co-owning that boat, Cornelius is placing himself directly into the economic engine of the continent. But we shouldn't romanticize this.
Right, it wasn't a luxury cruise.
Exactly. Boat owners of this tier weren't the ultra-rich elite, but they weren't the poorest laborers either. They were the strivers. Brad came from a rough-and-tumble family of skippers, and Cornelius brought the merchant capital.
A perfect match, really.
It was a highly pragmatic, deeply physical partnership, hauling animal pelts up and down a wild river.
And it was a volatile, aggressive life. We have to strip away any illusions about colonial folks being polite neighbors in powdered wigs.
Seriously.
The historical records show Cornelius is constantly in court. He is appearing in numerous lawsuits, sometimes as the guy suing, but often as the one being sued.
It was the Wild West.
It really was. It's an incredibly litigious environment where everyone is fighting for their piece of the pie. And his personal life is just as intense.
Very intense.
In 1658, he marries a woman named Meredy. And the backstory we have on Meredy is staggering. She was born in New Amsterdam in 1639, but when she was just a toddler in 1643, her own father was murdered by Native Americans.
What's fascinating here is how this forces us, as modern people, to confront the sheer, unrelenting trauma of this era.
Yeah, we forget how terrifying it was.
You have a man constantly fighting in court just to keep his business afloat, marrying a woman whose family had already experienced the extreme, fatal violence of the frontier. They are building a life on a powder keg.
The precarity doesn't end there, because Cornelius II's story in America is violently brief. After only about 8 to 10 years of hustling in New Amsterdam, by 1663, he is dead.
Just gone.
Dead in his 30s. And the situation he leaves behind is like something out of a visceral historical nightmare. Let's just freeze on this image for a second.
It's intense.
Meredy is pregnant with their third child. She is deathly ill, struck down by smallpox, a disease that was actively ravaging the colony and wiping out entire families.
A horrific disease.
It's February 17th, 1663. Meredy is lying in her sickbed, literally in the middle of childbirth. And things are so dire that a notary public is brought directly to her bedside so she can dictate her will.
It's an absolutely haunting scene to picture.
She essentially tells the notary, "If it pleases the Lord to take me out of this world into the eternal kingdom because of this illness, here is exactly what happens to my children."
Wow.
You really have to slow down and appreciate the sheer terror of that moment. You are in labor, covered in the agonizing lesions of smallpox, actively preparing for your own death while trying to give birth to a new life.
It perfectly synthesizes the brutal reality of early immigration. It dismantles the myth.
Yeah, the Thanksgiving myth.
Right. Cornelius II wasn't building some romanticized, peaceful American dream with a white picket fence and a quiet retirement. He was a hustler, scrambling for survival in a legally combative, physically exhausting, and biologically deadly environment.
But amazingly, the story doesn't end in that sickbed. Meredy actually survives the smallpox.
Against all odds.
She survives the childbirth. She even goes on to remarry later that same year because survival in that era meant you couldn't stay a widow for long. You needed a partner just to keep the farm or the business running.
It was pure economics.
Exactly. But because Cornelius II's life was cut so violently short, his son, Cornelius III, grows up to forge a completely different strategy.
Yeah, too.
Think about it. If you grew up watching the fallout of your dad dying from the exhaustion of being a river trader and your mom having to dictate her will between contractions, you're not going to just repeat their mistakes.
No, you learn from them.
Cornelius III realizes that playing the precarious river trading game is a fast track to an early grave. So he pivots from temporary high-risk trading to permanent land acquisition and deep alliances.
Yes, and we see an immediate shift in his identity to match that new survival strategy. Cornelius III, who was born in 1658, eventually anglicizes his last name.
Okay, blending in.
Exactly. He goes from Langevelt to Longfield. The British had sailed in and taken over New Amsterdam, renaming it New York, and he seamlessly adapts to the new power structure.
Smart move.
Very. But the real masterstroke of his life, and this is where the 22 years of research really shines, is captured in a primary source from 1679.
Okay.
It's the diary of a man named Jasper Dankart.
And this diary entry completely flips the script. Dankart writes about encountering a 22-year-old Cornelius III in a place called Piscataway in what is now New Jersey.
Right.
But Cornelius isn't living in a comfortable European settlement behind a wooden palisade. He is out living in a house with a Native American who is actively teaching him the local languages and how to trade.
Which is so unexpected for that time.
Right. Now, as a modern listener, when you hear a 1670s colonial trader, you probably picture a guy in a buckled hat marching in and trying to force European laws and commerce onto the local population.
Imposing their will.
Exactly. But Cornelius completely inverted that dynamic. He went into their homes to be the student.
That is exactly the mechanism of his success. Cornelius III understands that the future of wealth in the colonies isn't just about extracting resources like beavers and sailing them down the river. It's about embedding yourself in the pre-existing ancient trade networks.
Yeah.
By living with and learning from the local native populations, specifically the Raritan Indians, who are part of the larger Lenape people, he was learning the intricacies of the wampum economy.
Which was incredibly complex.
Oh, very. He learned the specific grading of pelts, the seasonal movements. He wasn't just a foreign trader setting up a tent. He was becoming an insider.
And he leverages that insider knowledge to build an absolute empire. Cornelius III starts buying massive tracts of land directly from the Raritan Indians.
Massive tracts.
But he's not just buying random fields to plant corn. I always hear colonial land grabs compared to a game of Monopoly, but that doesn't really explain the strategy.
Not really, no.
By buying the U-shaped junction of the Raritan and Millstone rivers at Lawrence Brook, He wasn't just buying farmland. He was essentially buying the only toll booth on a 17th century interstate highway.
That's a great way to put it.
If you wanted to move goods, transport timber, or communicate between settlements, you had to navigate those waters, and that meant going through him.
Exactly. Controlling the river junctions was the ultimate strategic chokehold. And the numbers on the land he eventually controls are staggering.
Give us the breakdown.
Let's look at the math. Cornelius III personally owned about 500 acres.
Okay.
Then he combines that with his stepfather's land, which is 2,450 acres.
Wow.
He acquires his neighbor John Inian's 1,280 acres, and he eventually takes over all the property of his father-in-law, a man named Captain Henry Greenland.
So he just rolls it all up?
He rolls it all up. When you aggregate all of that, Cornelius III controlled about 2,300 hectares.
Let me translate that for you. That is 23 square kilometers of prime New Jersey real estate.
It's massive.
Yeah.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to understand why 23 square kilometers matters so much.
Right, it's not just a big number.
In the colonial system, land on that scale wasn't just money in the bank. It was hard, undeniable political power. Because he controlled the foundational territory where people lived and traded, Cornelius III became a major political figure.
That makes sense.
He was appointed as a member of the House of Representatives in 1690 and a member of the Assembly in 1696. He and his family literally laid out the agricultural plots that would eventually grow into the city of New Brunswick.
Wow.
They weren't just participating in the colony, they were the architects of it.
So you have this guy whose father died a stressed-out, smallpox-adjacent river trader, and the son turns the family into the absolute lords of New Jersey.
An incredible turnaround.
You would think an empire of 23 square kilometers and architecting an entire city would guarantee a family's name and neon lights forever. You'd think the Longfield name would be equivalent to Rockefeller or Vanderbilt or Astor.
You would think so.
But history is remarkably efficient at erasing legacies.
It really is. The collapse of the male Longfield line is just as dramatic as its incredible rise.
How does it fall apart?
Well, when we trace the descendants down, we find Henry Longfield, who was Cornelius III's son. And Henry started out strong, continuing the family business. He was on the very first city council of New Brunswick in 1730.
Okay, keeping the political power going.
But by the time of his death in 1772, that entire 23 square kilometer empire was gone. He died entirely impoverished. The local sheriff literally had to draw up his final deeds.
Wait, how do you lose 23 square kilometers of prime real estate? I mean, you don't just misplace a city.
You lose it because colonial wealth was intensely physical and highly fragile. Unlike a modern stock portfolio, your wealth was tied up in barns, mills, livestock, and crops.
Right, tangible things.
And Henry lived right up to the eve of the American Revolution. The records note that the British completely destroyed his property and his house.
Oh, wow.
During conflicts of that era, armies didn't just fight on battlefields. They systematically dismantled local power structures. They would forage from local estates, burn the mills so the enemy couldn't grind wheat, and destroy the homes of local leaders.
That's devastating.
If an occupying army sweeps through your 23 square kilometers and burns the physical infrastructure to the ground, your wealth evaporates overnight. The physical empire simply slipped through their fingers.
But there is this incredible hidden irony to all of this. The Longfield name dies out in the late 18th century with a broke guy whose house was burned down. But their DNA, their actual lineage, had already seeped deeply into the very foundations of the nation.
It's true. The lines continue.
The historical records make sure to track the female lines, too. Cornelius III's granddaughter, a woman named Rachel, married a man named Thomas Laurens, and their descendants went on to become massive political figures.
Very prominent.
Thomas Laurens actually became the mayor of Philadelphia in 1728 and served again in 1735. And his son, also named Thomas, was mayor of Philadelphia from 1720 all the way to 1775.
It's a testament to how legacy is rarely straightforward. The name on the deed might vanish. The physical house might be burned to ash by the British Army, but the influence continues.
The bloodline survives.
Yeah, the bloodline of that 22-year-old kid sitting in a cabin learning to trade wampum with a Lenape Indian ends up essentially running the city of Philadelphia during the exact era of the American Revolution.
So what does this all mean? The researcher who spent 22 years digging through these archives, tracing the Van Landschut and Langevelt lines from that tiny town in East Flanders across a brutal ocean through smallpox and war, brings it all to this incredibly modern, almost poetic
It's
conclusion.
a great observation they make.
Back in 2004, the author of this massive study was driving down the New Jersey Turnpike Interstate 95, a massive paved toll road. And they realized, long after the fact, looking at the maps, that they were driving their car directly over the exact land that Cornelius II and Cornelius III had fought for, traded for, and ruled over.
Just thousands of cars flying by every hour at 70 miles an hour. Drivers drinking their morning coffee, completely unaware that they are driving straight through the ghost of a 23 square kilometer empire.
And the only silent witness left today, the only physical remnant of all that hustle and all that power, is a single small street sign near the highway that says Longfield Road.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it raises a really profound question for you, the listener, about how we view our own lives today.
How so?
We are so uniquely obsessed in our modern era with preserving our names, building our personal brands, and obsessively curating our digital footprints.
We document everything.
We do. We act as if we are building permanent legacies that will last forever. But if a family that owned 23 square kilometers of foundational American land, a family that literally laid the grid for cities and controlled the flow of early colonial trade, can be reduced by the slow, inevitable grind of history to a single, easily ignored street sign next to a toll road.
Okay.
What does that say about the true lifespan of a legacy? Are we ever really permanent owners of anything, or are we just temporary caretakers of the spaces we claim to own?
It's a deeply humbling thought.
Yeah.
From a small municipality in East Flanders to a smallpox-ridden New Amsterdam to trading along the riverbanks with the Lenape to owning an absolute empire and finally fading into the asphalt of Interstate 95.
It's quite a journey.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. The next time you find yourself staring up at a massive monument or even just driving down a generic, boring stretch of highway on your morning commute, take a second to think about the ghosts beneath your tires. Look up the history of the ground beneath your own feet, because you never truly know whose empire you might be standing on.